There is a structural problem at the heart of Western capitalist civilization that has persisted for over 500 years. And it is not the problem that most critics identify. It is not inequality per se, nor is it patriarchy in the colloquial sense, nor is it racism as typically understood through the lens of liberal discourse. The problem is far more precise, far more architectural, and far more dangerous to name. The problem is this: Western systems of capital accumulation and institutional power require that every body be sortable. Every human being must be legible to the system. You must fit into a tax category, an occupational classification, a racial designation, a gender binary, an educational credential pathway, a labor market segment. The entire machinery of modernity, from the Census Bureau to the Human Resources Department, from the University Admissions Office to the criminal justice system, depends on the capacity to sort bodies into pre-existing containers of institutional meaning. And when a body cannot be sorted, when it refuses categorization, or more dangerously, when it is constitutively incapable of being categorized because of the specific intersections of race, gender, class, geography, and cultural inheritance that it carries, the system faces a crisis. Not a moral crisis, a structural crisis. Because unsortable bodies expose the fact that the categories themselves are not natural, but constructed, not inevitable, but historically contingent, not permanent, but politically maintained. This lecture is about three formations that illuminate this structural crisis with extraordinary clarity. Olivia Dean, the biracial British singer-songwriter, whose Grammy-winning ascent from the BRIT School to global recognition reveals how a body that could not be absorbed by any existing system became, precisely because of that unabsorbability, the body with the highest ceiling in the room. Michèle Lamy, the French-Algerian cultural figure who moved through law, stripping, underground nightlife, and haute couture fashion without ever being fully captured by any single institutional identity, and who represents what I am calling the fashion alchemy thesis. The argument that fashion is one of the last remaining Western institutions capable of converting illegible power into legible social currency. And Magic City, the Atlanta strip club founded in 1985 that functions not as a site of mere exploitation, but as an alchemical formation, a structure that metabolizes women whom formal institutional systems have discarded and converts their embodied power into economic agency, however imperfect and contested that conversion may be. What connects these three formations is not a superficial thematic resemblance. What connects them is a shared structural relationship to a problem that Silvia Federici, the Hofstra University political philosopher and autonomist Marxist feminist, diagnosed in her landmark 2004 work, Caliban and the Witch: Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation. Federici's argument, which this lecture will develop and extend considerably beyond her original framework, is that the transition from feudalism to capitalism in Europe required not merely the enclosure of common lands, not merely the creation of a wage labor proletariat, not merely the colonial extraction of resources from the global South, but fundamentally and irreducibly a war against the female body. Specifically, a war against the female body's capacity to hold, generate, and transmit forms of power that could not be captured, measured, quantified, or redirected by the emerging institutions of capitalist governance. The witch hunts of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries were not, as mainstream historiography has often suggested, a remnant of medieval superstition that was swept away by the Enlightenment. They were, Federici argues, a constitutive element of capitalist modernity itself. They were the mechanism by which European states established the principle that no body would be permitted to exist outside the system's categories. And the bodies targeted most ferociously were those of women whose power was most resistant to categorization: the healer, the midwife, the herbalist, the sexually autonomous woman, the old woman who lived alone, the woman who refused the emerging nuclear family structure, the woman whose knowledge and authority derived from networks and traditions that predated and operated independently of both church and state. To understand why Olivia Dean's biracial liminality became an asset rather than a liability, why Michèle Lamy's refusal to be categorized made her the gravitational center of a billion-dollar fashion empire, and why Magic City functions as a cultural institution rather than merely a strip club, you must first understand what Federici was really arguing in Caliban and the Witch, because most people who reference that book have not actually grasped its most radical implication. Federici, who was born in Italy in 1942 and spent decades at Hofstra University on Long Island, developing her theoretical framework within the autonomist Marxist tradition, was doing something far more ambitious than simply adding a feminist footnote to Marx's theory of primitive accumulation. Marx, in Volume 1 of Capital, described primitive accumulation as the historical process by which peasants were violently separated from the land and the means of production, creating the conditions for the emergence of a wage-labor proletariat. The enclosure of the commons in England, the clearance of the Scottish Highlands, the colonial seizure of indigenous lands, these were the canonical examples of primitive accumulation. But Federici's intervention was to demonstrate that Marx's account was structurally incomplete. Primitive accumulation did not merely separate workers from the land. It separated reproduction from production. It separated the labor of creating and sustaining human life, the labor of bearing children, feeding families, healing the sick, maintaining communal bonds, transmitting knowledge, managing the emotional and spiritual life of communities, from the labor that was visible to the emerging capitalist economy. And this separation was not an incidental byproduct of capitalist development. It was its precondition. What does this mean concretely? In the feudal commons, women's labor was embedded in the total productive life of the community. Women controlled significant aspects of agricultural labor, managed common resources, served as healers and midwives, and maintained forms of knowledge transmission that operated through oral tradition, embodied practice, and communal ritual. Their labor was not paid in wages, but it was recognized as productive within the feudal social order. The commons themselves, the shared lands, forests, and waters that were accessible to all members of the community, provided the material basis for a form of female solidarity and autonomy that was not dependent on individual male patronage. Women gathered together to wash clothes, to tend gardens, to prepare food, to assist in childbirth. These were not merely domestic activities. They were the infrastructure of social reproduction, and they gave women a collective power base that was partially independent of the feudal hierarchy. When the commons were enclosed, when land was privatized and peasants were driven into wage labor, women lost not merely access to material resources, they lost the structural conditions for collective power. The nuclear family, which became the dominant unit of social organization under capitalism, isolated women from one another, made each woman dependent on an individual male wage earner, and rendered invisible the enormous volume of labor required to produce and reproduce the workforce. Federici's term for this is the patriarchy of the wage, the system in which men receive a wage for their labor in the public economy, and women perform unwaged labor in the household that is equally necessary for capitalism to function, but is systematically devalued and rendered invisible. This is not a description of male malice. It is a description of structural design. Capitalism required a mechanism for producing workers,
and that mechanism was the unpaid labor of women in the household. But for this mechanism to function, women's labor had to be redefined as natural, as biological destiny, as something that was not really labor at all. And any woman who resisted this redefinition, any woman who continued to exercise forms of power that could not be captured by the emerging categories of wife, mother, domestic servant, any woman whose knowledge, healing capacity, sexual autonomy, or communal authority marked her as operating outside the institutional order became, by definition, a threat to the system. She became a witch.
The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by the Dominican friar Heinrich Kramer, with the alleged but now heavily disputed co-authorship of Jakob Sprenger, is one of the most consequential documents in Western history, and it is almost never taught in the context where it belongs, which is not the history of superstition, but the history of institutional design. The document was published just 3 years after Pope Innocent VIII issued the papal bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus in 1484, which formally acknowledged the spread of witchcraft in the German territories and authorized Kramer and Sprenger to extirpate it. The bull gave these two Dominican inquisitors sweeping authority to investigate, prosecute, imprison, and punish any person of any rank who was suspected of witchcraft. What most people miss about this sequence of events is its institutional logic. Kramer was not a rogue actor. He was an institutional entrepreneur. He was using the machinery of papal authority to create a new category of criminal deviance, a new system for identifying, classifying, and eliminating bodies that did not fit the emerging social order. The Malleus Maleficarum is divided into 3 parts, and each part performs a specific institutional function. Part 1 establishes that witchcraft is real, that it represents a genuine existential threat to Christian society, and crucially, that any skepticism about the reality of witchcraft is itself a form of heresy. This is a brilliant institutional move. By criminalizing doubt, Kramer created a closed epistemological system. You could not question whether witches existed without becoming suspect yourself. Part 2 is a compendium of what witches allegedly do. They have sexual congress with demons. They cause impotence in men. They steal penises. This is literally in the text. And scholars like Moira Smith at Indiana University have written extensively about the gender politics embedded in these claims. They cause storms. They kill infants. They transform into animals. But what is structurally significant about Part 2 is not the content of the accusation. It is the taxonomic impulse behind them. Kramer is creating a classification system. He is defining the properties of the unsortable body so that the unsortable body can be identified and then classitable can be identified and eliminated. Part 3 is the legal manual. It provides step-by-step instructions for conducting a witch trial, from the methods of gathering accusations to the techniques of interrogation, including the explicit endorsement of torture, to the formal procedures for conviction and execution. Women who did not weep during their trial were automatically presumed guilty. The logic here is that a woman who maintains composure under extreme duress, who does not perform the expected emotional response of a terrified and submissive female subject, is demonstrating precisely the kind of ungovernable interiority that marks her as a witch. What Federici understood, and what connects the Malleus Maleficarum to Olivia Dean's career trajectory 5 centuries later, is that the document was not really about supernatural beliefs. It was about establishing the principle that female power must be categorizable, containable, and controllable, or it must be destroyed. The women targeted by the witch hunts were overwhelmingly poor women over the age of 40, often widows, often beggars, often women who lived alone and supported themselves through healing, herbalism, or midwifery.
In Ireland and the Scottish Western Highlands, where collective land tenure and kinship networks still provided a social safety net, there is virtually no historical record of witch hunts. This is not a coincidence. Where the commons still existed, where women still had access to collective resources and communal power structures, the category of the witch was unnecessary because the structural conditions that produced the unsizable body had not yet been created. Federici further demonstrates that the persecution of witches originated as a preoccupation of the upper classes. The intellectual framework for witch hunting was disseminated from the top down through published pamphlets, commissioned artwork, legal codes, and religious canon. Ordinary people did not spontaneously begin burning their neighbors. The category of the witch was manufactured by elites and distributed to the population through what we would now call institutional communication. The Malleus Maleficarum went through at least 28 editions between 1487 and 1600, and it was adopted by both Catholic and Protestant authorities. It was, in the most literal sense, the first manual for sorting bodies that refused to be sorted.
Federici makes a claim that is so radical it is often read past, even by sympathetic readers. She writes that the human body was the first machine invented by capitalism. This is not a metaphor, or rather it is a metaphor that functions as a precise structural description. Before the factory could exist, before the assembly line could be imagined, before the clock could regulate labor, the body itself had to be mechanized. The body had to be reconceived as a collection of separable functions that could be directed, measured, optimized, and controlled. The Cartesian revolution in philosophy, which separated mind from body and established the body as a machine governed by mechanical laws, was not a purely intellectual development. It was the philosophical legitimation of a social process that was already underway, the process of making the body legible to capital, sortable by its productive functions, and governable through institutional discipline. What did this mechanization look like in practice? It looked like the criminalization of contraception and abortion, which Federici documents extensively. In the late medieval period, women had significant control over reproduction through herbal knowledge, communal practices, and the expertise of midwives. As capitalism emerged and states became increasingly concerned with population management, this reproductive autonomy became intolerable. The state needed to control the production of labor power, and that meant controlling women's bodies. The demonization of midwives as witches was not incidental to this process. It was central. Midwives represented a form of female bodily knowledge that operated outside the authority of both church and state, outside the emerging medical profession that would eventually be monopolized by university-educated men, outside the systems of credentialing and licensing that would make healing a governable activity. A midwife's authority derived not from an institutional credential, but from embodied knowledge, from communal trust, from a lineage of practice that was transmitted through experience rather than text. She was, in the precise structural sense I am developing in this lecture, unsortable. Her power could not be captured by any existing institutional category, and therefore she had to be either absorbed into the new medical hierarchy, which meant being subordinated to male physicians, or destroyed. The mechanization of the body also meant the regulation of sexuality. Federici documents how, in the transition to capitalism, European states moved from a relatively permissive stance toward peasant sexuality, including the functional legalization of rape of proletarian women in late 14th century France and Venice, and the establishment of publicly funded brothels, both of which served to redirect male proletarian frustration away from class rebellion and toward sexual exploitation of women, to an increasingly restrictive regulation of all sexuality that could not be directed toward the production of legitimate offspring. Non-reproductive sexuality became suspect. Women who were sexually autonomous, who chose their own partners, who engaged in sexual practices that were not directed toward procreation within marriage, were performing a form of bodily autonomy that the emerging capitalist order could not metabolize. The accusation of sexual congress with the devil, which is one of the central charges in witch trial proceedings, is the supernatural encoding of a structural reality. A woman who has sex on her own terms, outside the sanctioned categories of wife and mother, is trafficking with powers that the system cannot control. This is the deep historical architecture that makes the stories of Olivia Dean, Michèle Lamy, and Magic City legible as something other than entertainment industry narratives. These are all instances of bodies that could not be sorted by the institutional systems they encountered, and the question in each case is, what happens when the system encounters a body it cannot classify? The answer, as we will see, varies dramatically depending on the specific historical moment, the particular institutional context, and the structural position of the body in question. But the question itself, the question of what happens to unsortable power, is the thread that connects a Dominican inquisitor in 15th century Germany to a biracial singer in 21st century London, to an Algerian French fashion priestess in contemporary Paris, to a strip club on Forsyth Street in downtown Atlanta. Before we can understand what happened to Olivia Dean at the BRIT School and why her structural position produced the outcome it did, we must first understand the specific architecture of belonging and exclusion within which her family history is embedded. Olivia Lauren Dean was born on March 14, 1999, in the London borough of Haringey and was raised in Hyams Park in the northeast of the city. Her father is English. Her mother, Christine Dean, is of Jamaican and Guyanese descent. Her maternal grandmother immigrated to the United Kingdom from Guyana at the age of 18 as a member of what is now known as the Windrush generation. And that single biographical fact, the fact that Dean's grandmother was Windrush, carries an entire structural history that most people who listen to Dean's music have no framework for understanding. The Windrush generation refers to the approximately 500,000 people who migrated to the United Kingdom from Caribbean countries between 1948 and 1971, following the British government's active recruitment of Commonwealth citizens to address the massive labor shortages created by the Second World War. The name derives from the HMT Empire Windrush, one of the first ships to bring a large group of Caribbean migrants to Britain, docking at Tilbury in June 1948. Under the British Nationality Act of 1948, citizens of British colonies and Commonwealth states were automatically British subjects with the right to live and work in the United Kingdom. They were not immigrants in the contemporary political sense. They were British citizens exercising a legal right. They came to work in the newly created National Health Service, in the transport system, in manufacturing, in construction. They built the infrastructure of post-war Britain. The 1971 Immigration Act formally ended this period of open migration, but gave indefinite leave to remain to all Commonwealth citizens already living in the UK. Most Windrush generation members who had arrived as children on their parents' passports had no individual documentation of their arrival. They did not need it. They were British. They had been British for their entire adult lives. They had paid taxes, raised families, owned homes, and contributed to the social fabric of British society for decades. But in 2012, the Home Office under Home Secretary Theresa May introduced what was officially called the Hostile Environment Policy, a set of measures designed to make life so difficult for undocumented immigrants that they would leave voluntarily. The policy required proof of immigration status for access to employment, housing, health care, banking, and other essential services.
and the Windrush generation, whose documentation was never formalized because it did not need to be, were suddenly recategorized. People who had been British subjects for 50 or 60 years were told they were illegal immigrants. They lost their jobs. They were denied medical treatment. They were evicted from their homes. They were detained in immigration removal centers. At least 83 people were wrongfully deported. Others died before receiving the compensation the government eventually and belatedly offered. The Windrush scandal, which erupted into public consciousness in 2018 following reporting by Amelia Gentleman of The Guardian, is typically understood as a failure of bureaucracy, a case of administrative incompetence producing unjust outcomes. But that framing obscures what was actually happening. The hostile environment policy was a sorting mechanism. It was a system designed to determine which bodies belonged and which did not. And the criterion for belonging was the ability to produce documentation that the system itself had never required. The Windrush generation was rendered unsortable not by any deficiency on their part, but by a deliberate restructuring of the categories of belonging. The system changed its sorting criteria retroactively and then punished the people who could not be sorted under the new regime. This is the world into which Olivia Dean's grandmother arrived. This is the structural inheritance that Dean carries. When Dean accepted her 2026 Grammy Award for Best New Artist and said in her acceptance speech that she was standing there as the granddaughter of an immigrant, as a product of bravery, she was not merely being sentimental. She was naming a structural position. She was identifying herself as a body that exists at the intersection of British institutional belonging and Caribbean diasporic exclusion, of whiteness and blackness, of professional class respectability and post-colonial precarity. And that structural position, as we will see, is precisely what made her unsortable by the BRIT School's internal systems of allocation and opportunity, and precisely what gave her the highest ceiling of anyone in her cohort.
The BRIT School for Performing Arts and Technology, located in Selhurst, Croydon, in South London, is the United Kingdom's leading non-fee-paying performing and creative arts secondary school. It was established in 1991 under the City Technology Colleges program, funded jointly by the British government and the British Record Industry Trust, the charitable arm of the recorded music industry. It is free to attend. It accepts students from across Greater London, with a small percentage from outside the region. It educates approximately 1,300 to 1,400 students between the ages of 14 and 19, offering specialized tracks in music, musical theater, dance, theater, film and media production, digital design, visual arts and design, and production arts, alongside a full academic curriculum of GCSEs and A-levels. Its alumni include Adele, Amy Winehouse, FKA Twigs, Jessie J, Tom Holland, Leona Lewis, Ray, Loyal Carner, Kate Nash, and Olivia Dean. By 2017, alumni of the school had sold a combined 125 million albums. None of this is in dispute, but what is rarely analyzed is the internal sorting logic of the BRIT School as an institution. The way that its different tracks, its network of industry connections, its alumni pathways, and its cultural ecology create specific ceilings and floors for different kinds of students. The BRIT School is not a meritocracy in the naive sense. It is a system that produces specific kinds of outcomes based on the structural position of the students who enter it. And those outcomes are shaped not only by talent, but by the legibility of each student's identity to the institutional categories that the school and the broader British entertainment industry recognize and resource. Consider the musical theater track. Musical theater in the UK is an established, well-funded, and institutionally connected industry with clear career pathways. West End productions, touring companies, cruise ship entertainment, regional theaters, casting agencies,
and talent management firms that specialize in placing musical theater performers in specific kinds of roles. The pipeline from the BRIT School's musical theater program to the West End is well-worn and well-resourced. But it is also a pipeline that rewards a specific kind of legibility. Musical theater performers must be classifiable. They are ingenues or character actors, sopranos or belters, leading ladies or ensemble players. The system knows what to do with them. Similarly, the music track produces musicians who are legible to the recorded music industry, singer-songwriters with a clear genre identity, producers with a defined sonic palette, performers who can be marketed within existing categorical frameworks. Olivia Dean entered the BRIT School in a theater course at the age of 15 and subsequently switched to studying music. This pivot is almost always narrated as a simple preference change, a young woman discovering her true passion. But structurally, it was something far more consequential. By leaving the theater track, Dean exited a system that would have sorted her into the categories available to a young biracial woman in British musical theater: a specific set of roles, a specific set of career pathways, a specific ceiling determined by the intersection of her racial presentation, her vocal type, and the available repertoire. The queer theater scene in particular, which has been a vibrant and significant force in British performing arts, has its own internal ecology, its own networks of patronage and opportunity, its own hierarchies of recognition. Some of Dean's contemporaries from the BRIT School occupy respected positions within that ecosystem. But that ecosystem, however progressive and culturally rich, is also resource-constrained. It has a limited number of positions of leadership and visibility, and Dean's specific combination of attributes, biracial, heteronormatively presenting but stylistically fluid, vocally rooted in soul and jazz traditions that did not map neatly onto the musical theater canon, made her a poor fit for the existing slots. What she was, in the language of this lecture's theoretical framework, was unabsorbable. Not rejected exactly, but structurally indigestible. The system could not metabolize her because the existing categories did not have a container for what she was. And this, counterintuitively, is precisely what produced her extraordinary ceiling. Because when the system cannot sort you, it also cannot limit you. The same liminality that prevents you from being slotted into an existing pathway also means that no existing pathway's ceiling applies to you. You are not constrained by the roles available to a musical theater performer, or by the genre expectations of a pop singer, or by the racial categories that determine which radio formats will play your music. You are in the open field, and if you have the talent, the work ethic, and the structural conditions to exploit that openness, the open field is where the largest outcomes are possible.
Let us now examine the specific socioeconomic and structural coordinates of Olivia Dean's position with the precision that this analysis demands. Her mother, Christine Dean, is a barrister, which in the British legal system is a specialist advocate who represents clients in court. Christine Dean was also, in June 2020, named the first Black deputy leader of a political party in Europe when she assumed that role in the Women's Equality Party. Her mother is, in other words, not merely a professional, but a member of the professional and political elite, someone who has navigated the intersecting systems of British legal credentialing, political party infrastructure, and racial barrier breaking with exceptional skill. We have less public information about Dean's father, who is English and white, but the biographical record indicates that the family environment was stable, culturally rich, and materially secure. Dean grew up with a father who had an extensive record collection, dancing in the kitchen to Steely Dan and Al Green, and a mother who introduced her to the music of Jill Scott, Angie Stone, and Lauryn Hill. She was given her middle name Lauren because her mother was a fan of the American singer. This is a household that is structurally positioned within the professional class, with deep roots in both Caribbean diasporic culture and British institutional life. Dean's mother navigated the British legal profession, which remains one of the most class-stratified and racially homogeneous professional sectors in the UK, and succeeded at its highest levels. The structural expectation, the default institutional trajectory, for a young person born into this household in 1999 in the London borough of Haringey would be to follow one of the credentialed professional pathways that the British system recognizes and rewards: law, finance, medicine, the civil service, higher education. These are the containers that the system has prepared. These are the categories into which a child of this background would normally be sorted. When Dean entered the BRIT School at 15, she was already making a structural choice that diverged from the default pathway. The BRIT School, despite its extraordinary alumni and its industry connections, is not a feeder institution for the professional class. It is a performing arts school in Croydon. It does not produce barristers or bankers. It produces artists, performers, and creative professionals, which means that Dean's entry into the BRIT School was itself an act of structural self-selection out of the category her background had prepared for her. She was the daughter of a barrister and a Windrush descendant who chose, at the age of 15, to commute 90 minutes each way to a performing arts school in South London rather than pursue the academic track that her mother's professional position had made available. And then, within the BRIT School, she made a second structural move. She switched from theater to music, exiting the one creative pathway that had the clearest institutional support and entering a field where her specific identity, biracial, soul-inflected, genre-fluid, had no existing template. Now consider what this double departure means in structural terms. Dean has left the professional class trajectory. She has left the musical theater pathway. She is biracial in a country where blackness is read through a very specific historical lens shaped by Caribbean immigration, the Windrush scandal, and the ongoing politics of British multiculturalism. She is not white enough to be absorbed into the predominantly white indie singer-songwriter ecosystem. She is not black enough, in the specific cultural coding of British music, to be automatically categorized as an R&B or grime artist. Her musical influences span Lauryn Hill and Carole King, Aretha Franklin and Paul Simon, Jill Scott and Joni Mitchell. She is, in every dimension that matters to institutional sorting, between categories. She occupies what the anthropologist Victor Turner would call a liminal position, a threshold state that is neither one thing nor another, and what I am calling in this lecture's framework a structurally unabsorbable position. But here is the critical insight that most analyses of Dean's career miss entirely. Her unabsorbability was not a handicap. It was a structural advantage of the highest order. And the reason it was an advantage has everything to do with the specific historical moment into which she emerged. In 2018, the year that the Windrush scandal erupted into British public consciousness, Olivia Dean was 19 years old and had just self-released her debut single, Reason to Stay. She was performing on the South Bank, busking for enough money to buy dinner. She was a backing vocalist for Rudimental, and by her own admission, not a very good one because she kept singing the melody instead of the harmony. She was, in every conventional metric of success, a nobody. But the world into which she was emerging was undergoing a structural recalibration that would make her specific form of unabsorbability extraordinarily valuable. The Windrush scandal did something to the British cultural establishment that extended far beyond the immediate political fallout of Amber Rudd's resignation and Theresa May's belated apology. It created, within the institutional systems of British media, entertainment, and cultural production, a structural demand for a very specific kind of body, a body that could represent the Caribbean diasporic presence in Britain, that could embody the emotional weight of the Windrush inheritance, that could perform belonging and exclusion simultaneously, that could speak to both the wound and the resilience, and that could do so in a form that was palatable, marketable, and legible to the predominantly white gatekeepers of the British entertainment industry. The system needed a Windrush granddaughter who could sell records. And Dean, by being biracial, by being the daughter of a barrister, by being BRIT School educated, by being musically rooted in a soul and jazz tradition that connoted authenticity without threatening the sensibilities of a mainstream audience, by being stylistically versatile enough to appear on a Glastonbury stage and a BBC Radio 2 playlist, was structurally positioned to meet this demand in a way that no one else in her cohort was. This is not a cynical observation. It is a structural one. Dean's talent is genuine, extraordinary, and undeniable. Her voice is one of the most distinctive and emotionally compelling instruments in contemporary popular music. Her songwriting, which draws on the traditions of confessional singer-songwriters while maintaining the harmonic sophistication of jazz and the rhythmic sensibility of soul, is genuinely remarkable. But talent alone does not produce a 2026 Grammy Award for Best New Artist. Talent alone does not produce 4 simultaneous top 10 singles in the UK, making her the first female solo artist to achieve that distinction. Talent alone does not produce a debut album, Messy, that earned a Mercury Prize nomination in 2023, or a second album, The Art of Loving, that topped the UK Albums Chart in 2025. What produces those outcomes is the intersection of talent with structural position. And Dean's structural position, her specific form of liminality, was uniquely suited to a historical moment in which the British cultural establishment was actively seeking to metabolize the contradictions exposed by the Windrush scandal. The system needed to demonstrate that it could accommodate, celebrate, and elevate a Windrush descendant. But it could not do so with a body that was too culturally specific, too politically confrontational, too racially unambiguous, too genre-bound. It needed a body that could move across boundaries, that could signify Caribbean heritage without being confined to Caribbean musical forms, that could perform blackness and whiteness simultaneously, that could be recognizable to both the Radio 1 audience and the Radio 2 audience, to both the Glastonbury crowd and the later, with Jules Holland viewer. It needed, in short, a body that was structurally unsortable but aesthetically coherent, a body that could not be contained by any single category, but that was nonetheless legible as a unified artistic identity. Dean was that body. And the very qualities that had made her unabsorbable within the BRIT School's internal sorting mechanisms, her biracialism, her genre fluidity, her refusal to be categorized as either a theater performer or a pop singer or an R&B artist, became the qualities that gave her the highest ceiling in the British music industry. Her liminality, which in another historical moment might have left her permanently between categories, permanently underfunded and under-resourced, became, in the post-Windrush moment, a form of structural power. The system did not merely accommodate her, it needed her.
Dean's second album, The Art of Loving, released in 2025, is not merely a collection of songs. It is a theoretical statement disguised as a pop record. And its theoretical allegiance is to Bell Hooks, the American Black feminist scholar, cultural critic, and author whose 2000 book, All About Love, New Visions, argued that love is not a feeling but a practice, not a spontaneous emotion, but a disciplined commitment to the growth and well-being of another person. Hooks, who was born Gloria Jean Watkins in 1952 in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and who died in 2021, developed a body of work that challenged both the Western romantic mythology of love as passionate possession and the feminist critique that dismissed love as a tool of patriarchal control. For Hooks, love was a radical political act, a form of resistance to the dehumanization produced by systems of domination, a practice that required courage, vulnerability, and the willingness to be fully present with another person across the boundaries of race, class, gender, and power. The title, The Art of Loving, itself directly echoes Erich Fromm's 1956 classic of the same name, which Hooks frequently cited and built upon. But Dean's album title, in the context of her structural position, is doing something more specific. It is claiming love as a form of knowledge production, a form of expertise that operates outside the credentialing systems of institutional authority. The art of loving is not taught in universities. It is not credentialed by professional bodies. It is not measurable by the metrics of capitalist productivity. It belongs to the domain of what Federici would call social reproduction, the labor of maintaining human connection, emotional sustenance, and communal life that capitalism has systematically devalued and rendered invisible. By placing this form of knowledge at the center of her artistic project, Dean is making a claim that resonates across the entire structural analysis this lecture has developed. The most important forms of human power are precisely those that cannot be sorted by institutional categories. The songs on the album enact this thesis. Man I Need, which became a UK #1 single, is not a conventional love song. It is a meditation on the structural conditions of need, on what it means to require another person, not as a consumer requires a product, but as a human being requires a form of sustenance that no market can provide. So Easy, To Fall in Love, explores the relationship between vulnerability and power, the paradox that the capacity to be wounded is also the capacity to be fully alive. Lady Lady is a self-address, a conversation between Dean and her own feminine identity that refuses to resolve into either self-empowerment or self-critique, but holds both in tension. These are songs that operate in what Hooks would call the space of radical openness, a space where the fixed categories of identity, including racial identity, gender identity, and class identity, become permeable without being erased. Dean does not pretend to be post-racial. She does not deny the structural significance of her biracialism, but she refuses to be contained by it, and her music creates a sonic and lyrical space in which the listener is invited to experience a similar permeability. What makes Dean's engagement with Hooks particularly structurally significant is that Hooks herself was, in many ways, an unsortable within the American Academy. Hooks refused to define this point as the grateless new visionals within American Academy of discovering the songs to become sortable in the air paeans of the structural development. But this move is not be exist, but she destied the songs to represented the luces by the family relators. Hooks refused to be the Chapman in the book of the over the world in the American Academy of Design, but she represented it over the book of this when not died that are conslish of the book. What makes Dean's engagement with Hooks Academy? Hooks refused the conventions of academic writing, publishing in an accessible, conversational style that was dismissed by many academic gatekeepers as insufficiently rigorous. She taught at institutions ranging from Yale to Berea College in Kentucky, moving between the elite and the marginal, the center and the periphery. She wrote about love and spirituality in an intellectual tradition that valued detachment and critique. She was, in the language of this lecture, uncontainable, too black for the white feminist establishment, too feminist for the black nationalist tradition, too spiritual for the secular left, too radical for the mainstream. And her work has proven to be the most enduring, the most widely read, the most structurally influential of any American feminist scholar of the late 20th century, precisely because its refusal of categorization gave it a reach that categorized work could never achieve. Dean is not Hooks's intellectual heir in a direct pedagogical sense, but she is Hooks's structural analog in the domain of popular music. She is producing work that refuses the available categories of pop, soul, R&B, jazz, and singer-songwriter, that operates in the liminal spaces between racial identities, between emotional registers, between the personal and the political, and that finds its power precisely in its uncategorizability. Michèle Lamy was born on April 20th, 1944, and raised in the Jura region near Oyonnax in the French Alps. She is of Algerian descent. Her grandfather made accessories for Paul Poiret, one of the most influential French couturiers of the early 20th century, which means that the fashion lineage in her family predates her by at least one generation. But the path from Oyonnax to becoming what Business of Fashion has called one of the most revered eccentrics in the fashion industry was not a career trajectory in any conventional sense. It was an exercise in serial unabsorbability, a decades-long demonstration of what happens when a body refuses to be sorted by any system it encounters. In the 1960s and 1970s, in Paris, Lamy worked simultaneously as a criminal defense lawyer and as a cabaret dancer, which is to say, she occupied two categories that the French professional and social order considered mutually exclusive. A lawyer is credentialed, respectable, institutionally legible. A cabaret dancer is embodied, marginal, sexually marked. To be both at the same time is to perform a kind of structural impossibility, to insist on occupying a position that the system's categories cannot accommodate. And Lamy did not merely tolerate this impossibility, she inhabited it as a form of power. She was studying with the postmodern philosopher Gilles Deleuze during this same period, absorbing a theoretical framework that valorized nomadism, deterritorialization, and the refusal of fixed identity. And she was living that framework in real time, in her own body, in the streets and courtrooms and cabarets of Paris. Lamy left the legal profession, she has said, when she found herself more interested in her defendants than in the lawyers practicing in the French legal system. This is a crucial detail. The legal system is a sorting mechanism par excellence. It classifies human behavior into categories of guilt and innocence, crime and compliance, punishment and reward. To be a defense lawyer is to work within this sorting mechanism, to navigate its categories on behalf of clients who have been classified as deviant. But Lamy was drawn to the defendants, to the people who had been sorted into the system's most stigmatized categories, not as cases to be managed, but as human beings who interested her. She was, in other words, recognizing in her defendants a version of her own unsortability. They were the people the system could not accommodate, and she was more interested in them than in the system itself. So she left. In 1979, Lamy moved to Los Angeles. There, she continued to perform as a stripper. She lived in the Hotel Chelsea in New York during its punk heyday. She settled in Los Angeles at the urging of her brother and established a fashion line called Lamy in 1984 that became successful enough to be carried by luxury department stores like I. Magnin. She ran two cult restaurants and nightclubs, Café des Artistes and Les Deux Cafés, which in the 1990s became some of Hollywood's most exclusive insider destinations, hosting figures like Madonna, Joni Mitchell, and Sharon Stone. She married the experimental filmmaker Richard Newton and had a daughter, Scarlett Rouge, who is now an artist. She produced Newton's first film, and then, in the most consequential decision of her professional life, she hired a young pattern cutter named Rick Owens in 1990 for her clothing line. Owens, who was born in 1961 in Porterville, California, and had studied fine arts at Otis College of Art and Design, was, at the time Lamy hired him, an obscure figure in the Los Angeles fashion world. He was, like Lamy, structurally unsortable, a bisexual man from a small California town who was making clothing that did not fit any existing market category. Too dark for mainstream fashion, too luxurious for punk, too American for the European avant-garde. Lamy recognized in Owens what she recognized in her former defendants, a form of power that the existing system could not categorize. He became her business partner and eventually her husband. Together, in 2004, they established Owenscorp, the fashion company that now encompasses Rick Owens's clothing lines, Lamy's furniture and jewelry design, and a sprawling cultural enterprise that includes exhibitions, performances, art fairs, and collaborations with artists ranging from Marina Abramovic to FKA Twigs.
What Lamy has done, and what the fashion industry has done through and around her, is something that Federici's framework allows us to name with precision.
It is alchemy. And I use this term not as a metaphor, but as a structural description of a specific form of value transformation that operates outside the normal circuits of capitalist legibility. In the classical alchemical tradition, the philosopher's stone was the substance that could transmute base metals into gold, transforming materials that had no recognized value within the dominant economic system into the system's ultimate store of value. The alchemists occupied a paradoxical social position, revered and feared, necessary and suspect, positioned outside the orthodox institutions of knowledge, the university, the church, but performing a function that those institutions desperately wanted to control. The alchemist's knowledge was illegible to the institutional order. It could not be fully captured by any existing system of classification. And that illegibility was both the source of the alchemist's power and the reason for the alchemist's marginalization. Fashion, I am arguing, is the last functioning alchemical system in Western culture. It is the one remaining institutional formation that is capable of taking a body, an identity, a set of attributes that are illegible to every other system of capitalist categorization, and converting them into social power, economic value, and cultural authority. Every other system requires legibility as a precondition for participation. The legal system requires that you be classifiable as a legal subject with specific rights and obligations. The financial system requires that you be classifiable as a credit risk, an investor, a consumer, a debtor. The educational system requires that you be classifiable as a student within a specific disciplinary framework. The labor market requires that you be classifiable as a worker with specific skills, credentials, and experience. If you cannot be classified, you cannot participate. You are expelled from the system. But fashion does not require legibility. Fashion requires presence. Fashion requires the capacity to generate affect, attention, desire, and unease. Fashion requires precisely the qualities that make a body unsortable: ambiguity, transgression, the refusal of fixed categories, the capacity to hold contradictions without resolving them. A fashion icon is not someone who fits neatly into an existing category of beauty, taste, or style. A fashion icon is someone who creates a new category through the sheer force of their unabsorbability. They are the philosopher's stone, the substance that does not obey the existing rules of value transformation, but that can, through its mere presence, transform the value of everything around it. Lamy is the purest expression of this alchemical function. She is an 81-year-old woman of Algerian descent with gold-plated teeth, Berber-inspired tattoos on her fingers, darkened fingertips, a vertical line tattooed on her forehead, and a personal aesthetic that fuses ancient North African mysticism with post-industrial brutalism. She is a former stripper, a former lawyer, a former restaurant owner, a furniture designer, a jewelry maker, a musician. She formed the band Lavascar with the artist Nico Vascalari and her daughter. A boxing practitioner who has done contactless boxing for 35 years and who installed her own boxing gym, Lamyland, inside Selfridges in London. She has appeared in FKA Twigs's short film M3LL155X. She has been photographed by Stephen Klein and Mario Sorrenti. She has curated installations at Frieze, the Barbican, and the Venice Biennale. In 2025 and 2026, she was a central figure in the landmark Rick Owens retrospective at the Palais Galliera in Paris. No institutional system can categorize Michèle Lamy. She is not a fashion designer in the conventional sense. Rick Owens is the named designer, and the clothing bears his name.
She is not a muse in the conventional sense. Owens himself has said that no one would think of Lamy as a passive muse. She is not a businesswoman in the conventional sense, though she manages the furniture and art divisions of Owenscorp and has described herself as an entrepreneur. She is not an artist in the conventional sense. Her daughter has said that Lamy does not want to sit in her pain, does not want to suffer, does not want to be vulnerable in the way that the romantic mythology of the artist demands. She is all of these things and none of them. She is the body that every system tries to absorb and fails. And fashion, the last alchemical system, does not try to absorb her. It recognizes that her unsortability is itself the source of value. It does not ask her to be legible. It asks her to be present. And her presence transforms the value of everything around her, just as the philosopher's stone transforms base metals into gold. The fact that Lamy studied with Gilles Deleuze during her years as a law student and cabaret dancer in Paris is not biographical trivia. It is a structural key to understanding the theoretical foundations of what she has become. Deleuze, along with his collaborator Félix Guattari, developed in works like 1,000 Plateaus a philosophical vocabulary that describes exactly the kind of movement that Lamy has performed across institutions throughout her life. Deterritorialization in Deleuze and Guattari's framework is the process by which a system's boundaries are disrupted, its codes scrambled, its categories rendered inoperative. A deterritorialized body is a body that has been dislodged from its assigned position within the social order and is moving through a space that the system's maps cannot chart. But deterritorialization is always paired with re-territorialization. The system responds to disruption by creating new boundaries, new categories, new mechanisms of capture. And the question for Deleuze and Guattari is always whether the movement of deterritorialization can outpace the system's capacity to re-territorialize, whether the nomad can keep moving faster than the borders can be redrawn. Lamy's entire life can be read as an answer to this question. She has moved from law to stripping, from stripping to fashion design, from fashion design to restaurant culture, from restaurant culture to avant-garde fashion, from fashion to art, from art to boxing, from boxing to music, from music to furniture, from furniture to installation art. And at every point in this trajectory, the system has tried to capture her, to assign her to a category, to make her legible, and at every point she has moved again. She is not running from the system, she is performing the Deleuzian operation of continuous deterritorialization, staying in motion not as an escape, but as a practice of power. This is what I call the Lamy principle, the proposition that in a system designed to sort and contain bodies, the most powerful structural position is permanent unsortability, maintained not through passive ambiguity, but through active movement across institutional boundaries. The Lamy principle is distinct from mere eclecticism or dilettantism. It is not about doing many things badly. It is about doing many things in a way that reveals the arbitrariness of the boundaries between them. When Lamy runs a boxing gym inside a luxury department store, she is not engaging in novelty. She is demonstrating that the boundary between sport and commerce, between physical discipline and consumer desire, between working-class culture and haute bourgeois retail, is a constructed boundary that can be dissolved.
When she curates a performance series at an art fair, she is demonstrating that the boundary between art and spectacle, between high culture and underground culture, between the museum and the nightclub, is a constructed boundary that exists only because institutions maintain it. She is, in the Deleuzian sense, a war machine, a force that operates outside the apparatus of the state and that derives its power precisely from its refusal to be captured by any system of categorization. And fashion, I repeat, is the institutional field that can metabolize this kind of war machine without destroying it. The fashion industry does not need Lamy to be legible. It needs her to be mysterious, uncategorizable, omnipresent, and irreducible. It needs her to be the thing that no other system can accommodate, because the fashion industry's competitive advantage over every other cultural industry is its capacity to convert the illegible into the desirable. This is the alchemical operation. This is the philosopher's stone. And Lamy, in her gold teeth and her Berber tattoos and her black-dipped fingers, is its most accomplished practitioner.
One of the critical structural parallels between Olivia Dean and Michèle Lamy, and one that connects both to the deeper analysis of Federici's work, is the way that each of them uses the presentation of gender as a structural technology rather than as a fixed identity position. Both Dean and Lamy are capable of presenting with what reads as masculine power and with what reads as hyper-feminine softness, and neither of them resolves this oscillation into a stable gender presentation. This is not a matter of personal style. It is a structural operation with direct implications for the argument about unsortable bodies and alchemical power. Olivia Dean and the middle of the critical Dean is the way that each of them uses the deeper analysis between something of middle dates with what reads as a structural penality. This is not a matter of personal style, with the desire that of softable as hyper-feminine softness, and neither of them resolves this oscillation with the direct implication of the argument about unsortable bodies and alchemical power. This is not a matter of personal style. It is a structural power and alchemical power with the direct implication of the argument about unsortable bodies and alchemical power. This is not a matter of personal style. It is a structural operation with desire that of softable as hyper-feminine softness, and neither of them resolves this oscillation with the direct implication of the argument about unsortable bodies. This is not a matter of personal style. It is a structural operation, and with the direct implication of the argument about unsortable bodies and alchemical power. Both Dean and Lamy is a matter of personal style. It is a structural operation with direct implications and alchemical power. Federici's analysis in Caliban and the Witch demonstrates that one of the central achievements of the transition to capitalism was the creation of a fixed, binary gender system in which feminine was defined as passive, domestic, reproductive, emotional, and natural, while masculine was defined as active, public, productive, rational, and cultural. This binary was not inherited from the feudal period. It was produced by the transition itself. In the feudal commons, gender roles were differentiated but not rigidly binary in the way that capitalist modernity would demand. Women performed agricultural labor, managed resources, exercised public authority in communal settings, and maintained forms of knowledge and practice that required the full range of human capacities. The witch hunts, among their other structural functions, served to enforce the new gender binary by eliminating women who transgressed it, women who healed, performing a public knowledge-based function reserved for credentialed men, women who were sexually autonomous,
performing a form of active desire reserved for men, women who lived alone, refusing the domestic unit that was becoming the mandatory container for feminine existence. Dean's gender presentation oscillates between registers in a way that makes her unclassifiable within this binary. She can appear on stage in a form-fitting gown that performs conventional femininity to its highest degree, and in the next moment command the space with a physical and vocal authority that reads as masculine in its confidence, its directness, its refusal of coy performance. This is not gender fluidity in the contemporary identity politics sense. It is something more structurally precise. It is the refusal to be sorted by the gender categories that the system requires for legibility. A singer who presents as consistently feminine can be sorted into the ingenue category, the love song category, the female vocalist category. A singer who presents as consistently masculine-coded can be sorted into the power artist category, the genre-bending category, the androgyny category. But a singer who moves between these registers without committing to either one, who is both tender and commanding, both vulnerable and powerful, both soft and dangerous, cannot be sorted. And the unsortable body, as we have established, is the body with the highest ceiling. Lamy's gender presentation operates on the same structural principle, but through a radically different aesthetic vocabulary. Lamy does not oscillate between feminine and masculine. She dissolves the distinction entirely. Her gold teeth, her tattooed fingers, her darkened hands, her architectural clothing, her shaved or cropped hair. These are markers that do not map onto any existing gender presentation. They are simultaneously ancient and futuristic, simultaneously tribal and industrial, simultaneously intimidating and beautiful. Fashion critics have called her a Gothic priestess, an avant-garde matriarch, a sphinx. Each of these descriptors is an attempt to sort her, and each fails, because she is not a priestess. She holds no religious office. Not a matriarch. She does not preside over a family in the conventional sense. Not a sphinx. She is not silent. She is voluble, opinionated, and engaged. She is the body that defeats description, and in a system that requires description for categorization and categorization for control, the body that defeats description is the body that cannot be controlled.
Now we must make the transatlantic crossing and examine how the same structural dynamics that produced Olivia Dean's unsortability in London and Michèle Lamy's unsortability in Paris operate in a radically different but structurally analogous context, the metropolitan Atlanta region, and specifically the institutional sorting mechanisms that shape the economic trajectories of women in that city. Atlanta's economy is dominated by a relatively small number of institutional corridors that absorb the majority of the working population. Healthcare is by far the largest, anchored by systems like Emory Healthcare, Grady Memorial Hospital, Piedmont Healthcare, Wellstar Health System, and Northside Hospital, along with a vast network of nursing homes, outpatient clinics, home health agencies, and medical staffing companies. The metro area, including counties like Gwinnett, DeKalb, Fulton, Cobb, and Clayton, contains one of the highest concentrations of healthcare employment in the American South. For women in the Atlanta metro area, particularly Black women without four-year college degrees, the healthcare corridor functions as the default sorting mechanism. Certified nursing assistant programs, medical billing and coding certifications, phlebotomy training, licensed practical nursing credentials, these are the institutional pathways that the system has prepared. These are the categories into which women are sorted.
The logic is the same as the logic that sorts young people born in Haringey into professional class trajectories, or that sorts BRIT School students into musical theater career pipelines. The system identifies the available institutional containers, the existing categories of economic participation, and directs bodies into them. If you are a woman in Gwinnett County without a college degree, the system will push you toward healthcare employment. If you are a woman with a college degree, the system will push you toward healthcare administration, insurance, or hospital management. The political economy of the region, the tax structures, the distribution of educational institutions, the locations of major employers, the transportation infrastructure, all of these factors create a gravitational field that pulls women toward the healthcare corridor. But what happens when the trajectory is derailed? What happens when a woman enters the healthcare pipeline and the pipeline fails, whether because of personal circumstances, a pregnancy, a family crisis, a mental health episode, or because of structural conditions, a recession, a facility closure, a change in Medicaid reimbursement policy that eliminates positions, or because of the accumulating weight of undercapitalization, student loan debt for a credential that does not lead to a living wage, childcare costs that exceed the income from an entry-level healthcare position, transportation barriers in a metro area with inadequate public transit. When the system can no longer sort you into the healthcare corridor, it does not find you another corridor. It discards you. This is the structural mechanism that Federici identified as primitive accumulation operating in perpetuity. The system does not merely sort bodies once. It continuously sorts and resorts them, and bodies that fall out of the categories are expelled, not into a safety net, but into what the sociologist Loïc Wacquant would call the hyper-ghetto, the zone of concentrated disadvantage that serves as capitalism's structural remainder. And it is precisely here, in the zone of structural remainder, that alchemy becomes possible. Because the women who have been discarded by the healthcare corridor, who have been expelled from the system's categories, who are carrying forms of embodied power, charisma, physical beauty, social intelligence, performance capacity, entrepreneurial instinct, that no institutional credential can capture, these women do not disappear. They do not simply cease to exist because the system can no longer sort them. They find their way to formations that can metabolize what they are. And in Atlanta, the most significant of those formations is Magic City. Magic City was founded in 1985 by Michael Barney, a Duke University graduate from New Jersey who had moved to Atlanta and was selling toner cartridges when he became a regular at local strip clubs and decided the concept could be dramatically improved. The club opened in a former print shop at 241 Forsyth Street in South Downtown Atlanta with a single dancer. Over the next 4 decades, it became what Sports Illustrated has called a legendary strip club, what Defector has called a genuine cultural institution, what the Atlanta Hawks, in a promotion that the NBA subsequently canceled under pressure, called one of Atlanta's iconic cultural institutions, and what the producers of the 2025 Starz docuseries Magic City, an American Fantasy, have described as the Black Studio 54 of the South. None of the conventional descriptions of Magic City capture what it actually is in structural terms. It is not merely a strip club. It is not merely a music industry incubator, though it has been the testing ground where DJs determined whether songs would become hits, where Future, Migos, and Jeezy broke records, where DC the Brain Supreme established the blueprint for using strip club DJ booths as A&R platforms. It is not merely a networking hub, though Jermaine Dupri's observation that on any given Monday night you could stand beside a millionaire, the biggest thief in Atlanta, the biggest drug dealer in Atlanta, the police, and one of the biggest rappers in the world, all in the same room, captures something essential about its function as a space where normally segregated social worlds converge. It is not merely an economic engine, though the money that flows through Magic City and the broader Atlanta strip club ecosystem has supported entire networks of childcare, housing, education, and entrepreneurship. What Magic City is, in the structural framework of this lecture, is an alchemical formation. It is a structure that performs the same philosophical operation that Michèle Lamy performs in the fashion world. It takes bodies that have been discarded by the formal institutional order, bodies whose power cannot be captured by any existing system of classification, not by the healthcare credentialing system, not by the educational system, not by the formal labor market, not by the criminal justice system, not by the welfare state. And it converts that unclassifiable power into economic agency. It transforms lead into gold. The women who dance at Magic City are not passive objects of male desire. They are, as the club's most celebrated performers have consistently attested, entrepreneurs, athletes, performers, social strategists, and financial managers who have developed extraordinarily sophisticated skill sets that no formal institution recognizes or credentials. The athleticism required for pole work alone is comparable to that of professional gymnastics. The social intelligence required to navigate a room full of millionaires, drug dealers, police officers, and rap stars simultaneously, extracting economic value from each interaction while maintaining physical safety and emotional composure, is a form of labor that no business school teaches and no MBA program credentials. This is the alchemy. The women of Magic City possess forms of power, embodied power, social power, performative power, entrepreneurial power that are illegible to every formal institutional system. The healthcare system cannot see them. The educational system cannot credential them. The labor market cannot classify them. The tax system struggles to capture their income. Many dancers are classified as independent contractors, not employees, which was the subject of a 2014 lawsuit that resulted in a $1.1 million settlement in 2017. They exist in the structural position that Federici's analysis identifies as the most threatening to capitalist order. They are bodies whose power cannot be sorted. But Magic City provides a container. Not a container in the sense that Federici uses the term, not a mechanism of suppression and control, but a container in the alchemical sense, a vessel within which transformation can occur. The retort, the crucible, the space in which base materials are subjected to heat and pressure and emerge as something of higher value. Magic City does not make these women legible to the formal system. They remain illegible. But it provides a space in which their illegibility can be monetized, celebrated, and converted into a form of economic power that, while imperfect and contested and entangled with exploitation and risk, is nonetheless real.
At this point in the analysis, it is necessary to address directly the moral complexity of using a strip club as an example of an alchemical formation, because the failure to address this complexity would be intellectually dishonest and would undermine the structural argument I am building. The conventional moral critique of strip clubs is straightforward. They are sites of exploitation where women's bodies are commodified for male pleasure, where the power dynamics are overwhelmingly skewed toward the men who pay and away from the women who perform, where the risks of abuse, trafficking, addiction, and psychological harm are well documented and real. A capital B News investigation published in September 2025 specifically highlighted Magic City as an example of how Atlanta strip clubs may facilitate sex trafficking risks, citing the venue's high-profile environment as a potential entry point for the exploitation of vulnerable women. This critique is not wrong. The exploitation is real. The risks are real. The moral questions are genuine.
But the structural reading I am offering does not attempt to resolve the moral questions by pretending that exploitation does not exist. It attempts to explain why exploitation and empowerment can coexist within the same formation, and why the formations that convert illegible power into economic agency are always structurally entangled with exploitation. The reason is simple. The formal institutional order that has discarded these women is the same order that defines the conditions under which their reintegration into the economy is possible. If the healthcare system had not failed them, if the educational system had credentialed their actual capabilities, if the labor market had a category for the kind of embodied, performative, entrepreneurial labor they perform, they would not need Magic City. But the system has no such category. It cannot see them. And so the only formations that can metabolize their power are formations that operate at the margins of formal legality, morality, and institutional recognition. This is precisely the dynamic that Federici describes in Caliban and the Witch, when she documents the establishment of publicly funded brothels in 14th and 15th century Europe. Federici argues that the European nobility and the church established and managed these brothels not out of moral laxity, but as a deliberate strategy to manage social conflict, to redirect proletarian male frustration away from class rebellion and toward the sexual exploitation of proletarian women, and to ensure that workers were not lured into heretical sects that offered alternative forms of community and sexual expression. The brothel, in Federici's analysis, was a containment formation, a structure that metabolized a form of power, female sexuality, proletarian desire, that threatened the existing order and converted it into a form that served the system's needs. Magic City is a very different kind of formation, operating in a very different historical context, but it shares this structural logic of conversion. It takes power that the system cannot categorize and converts it into a form that the system can, if not fully legitimize, at least tolerate and partially capture. And crucially, it provides the women who participate in it with something that no other available formation provides: economic agency. Not perfect agency, not uncompromised agency, not agency that resolves the contradictions of race, class, gender, and exploitation, but real material agency that manifests as income, as financial resources that can be directed toward childcare, housing, education, entrepreneurship, and the support of families and communities. The moral trap is the demand that we choose. Is Magic City exploitation or empowerment? The structural reading refuses this choice. It insists that the question is wrongly framed. The correct question is, what does it tell us about the structure of the system that the only formation capable of metabolizing these women's power is one that operates at the intersection of exploitation and empowerment? And the answer to that question takes us back to Federici, back to the Malleus Maleficarum, back to the fundamental structural logic of capitalist modernity. The system requires that every body be sortable, and when a body cannot be sorted, the system either destroys it, the witch, or expels it into a marginal zone where its power can be partially captured under conditions of exploitation, the brothel, the strip club. The system never creates a legitimate category for unsortable power. It cannot, because to do so would be to acknowledge that its categories are not natural, but constructed, not inevitable, but contingent, not permanent, but maintained by force. We are now in a position to see the structural parallel with full clarity. 3 formations, 3 different institutional contexts, 3 different historical and geographical situations, 1 shared structural logic. Olivia Dean entered the BRIT School as a biracial daughter of a barrister and a Windrush descendant. The school's internal sorting mechanisms could not classify her. She was not a theater student, not a pop singer, not an R&B artist, not a jazz musician. Her biracialism made her illegible to the racial categories that structure the British music industry. Her genre fluidity made her illegible to the marketing categories that determine which radio formats will play a song, which playlists will feature an artist, which awards categories an album will be submitted to. The system could not absorb her. But in the specific historical moment of the post-Windrush reckoning, her unabsorbability became the system's most valuable resource. The British cultural establishment needed a body that could perform the reconciliation of Caribbean diasporic inheritance with British institutional belonging. And Dean, precisely because she could not be sorted into any existing category, was the body that could perform this function. Her alchemy was the conversion of structural liminality into cultural authority. The container was the British recorded music industry. The philosopher's stone was her voice, her songwriting, her capacity to hold contradictions without resolving them, her refusal to be anything other than the entirety of what she is. Michèle Lamy moved through French law, Parisian cabaret, New York punk, Los Angeles underground nightlife, fashion design, restaurant culture, and avant-garde art. Every system she encountered tried to sort her, and every system failed. She was too Algerian for the French legal establishment, too intellectual for the cabaret, too embodied for the academy, too old for the fashion industry's conventional standards, too strange for the mainstream, too commercial for the art world. But fashion, the last alchemical system, did not try to sort her. It recognized that her unsortability was the value. Owenscorp does not function despite Lamy's uncategorizability. It functions because of it. The Rick Owens brand is, at its core, a machine for converting the illegible into the desirable, for taking materials, aesthetics, bodies, and ideas that no other system can accommodate and presenting them as objects of beauty, fascination, and commercial value. Lamy is not the muse of this enterprise. She is its alchemical principle. She is the philosopher's stone. The women of Magic City entered the healthcare corridor, the educational system, the formal labor market. The system tried to sort them into the available categories: CNA, medical biller, LPN, home health aide. And when the system could not accommodate them, whether because of personal circumstance, structural failure, or the simple fact that their actual capabilities exceeded any category the system offered, they were expelled. But their power did not disappear. Their embodied intelligence, their social acuity, their physical skill, their entrepreneurial instinct, their capacity to command attention and generate economic value through performance. These forms of power persisted even after the formal system had discarded them. And Magic City provided the container, the retort, the crucible, within which that unsortable power could be converted into economic agency. The alchemy is imperfect. The container is compromised. The exploitation is real. But the conversion is also real.
What connects all three formations, and what connects them to the deepest layer of Federici's analysis, is the persistence of what I am calling the ancient feminine, a form of power associated with the female body that predates capitalist modernity, that predates the binary gender system, that predates the institutional categories through which Western civilization organizes its relationship to power, and that has never been fully captured, suppressed, or eliminated, despite 5 centuries of systematic effort. The ancient feminine is not a mystical concept. It is a structural one. It refers to the specific forms of knowledge, authority, and social power
that are encoded in female embodiment, in the practices of healing, nurturing, community building, reproductive control, emotional intelligence, and embodied performance that have been central to human social organization for millennia, but that capitalist modernity has systematically devalued, criminalized, or rendered invisible. The witch hunts were the most dramatic attempt to eliminate these forms of power, but they were not the only attempt. The professionalization of medicine, which removed healing from the domain of female communal practice and placed it under the authority of university-credentialed male physicians. The nuclear family, which isolated women from one another and subordinated their labor to an individual male wage earner. The educational system, which credentialed specific forms of knowledge, abstract, textual, theoretical, and devalued others, embodied, practical, communal. The labor market, which recognized wage labor as real work and relegated reproductive labor to the status of natural duty. Each of these institutional developments was, in its structural function, an attempt to contain the ancient feminine, to sort female power into categories that the system could manage and control. But the ancient feminine persists. It persists in Olivia Dean's voice, which carries the timbral inheritance of Aretha Franklin, Jill Scott, and Lauryn Hill, a lineage of black female vocal power that transmits forms of emotional knowledge that no academic discipline can fully theorize or no market fully commodify. It persists in Michèle Lamy's presence, which combines North African ancestral marking, embodied practice, 35 years of boxing, and a form of social authority that derives not from any institutional credential, but from the sheer force of her refusal to be categorized. It persists in the women of Magic City, whose physical virtuosity, social intelligence, and performative power represent forms of embodied knowledge that are simultaneously indispensable to the functioning of the economies they inhabit and invisible to the institutional systems that govern those economies. And the system's response to the ancient feminine is always the same, whether the year is 1487 or 2026. It attempts to sort it. It attempts to force unsortable power into pre-existing categories. And when the power resists categorization, the system either destroys it, the witch hunt, expels it, structural exclusion from formal economies, or creates marginal containers within which it can be partially captured, the brothel, the strip club, the fashion system. What the system never does, what it structurally cannot do, is create a legitimate institutional category for unsortable power. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power by the system from animal power. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power that the form of women close for minimum and successful, which would bring 60% in system relatorgen. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, which would create marginal conteneries for unsortable power. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women close for minimum and successful, which would bring 60% in system relatorgen. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women close for minimum and successful, is create a legitimate institutional category for unsortable power, because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women close for minimum and successful, which would bring 60% in system relatorgen. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women close for minimum and successful, is create a legitimate institutional category. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power,
that the form of women clothes for minimum and successful is create a legitimate institutional category, because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women clothes for minimum and successful is create a legitimate institutional category. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women clothes for minimum and successful is create a legitimate institutional category. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women clothes for minimum and successful is create a legitimate institutional category. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women clothes for minimum and successful is create a legitimate institutional category. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women clothes for minimum and successful is create a legitimate institutional category. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women clothes for minimum and successful is create a legitimate institutional category. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women clothes for minimum and successful is create a legitimate institutional category. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women clothes for minimum and successful is create a legitimate institutional category for unstoppable power. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women clothes for minimum and successful is create a legitimate institutional category. Because to do so, that the remember of the specific for the developing ground power, that the form of women clothes for minimum and successful is create a legitimate institutional category. Because to do so would be to acknowledge that the system's categories are themselves contingent, constructed, and maintained by force, which would undermine the fundamental legitimating myth of capitalist modernity, that its categories are natural, rational, and inevitable. The fashion system's exceptional capacity to metabolize unsortable power is not accidental. It is a structural feature of the industry that derives from a specific historical development. Fashion, unlike virtually every other major Western industry, was never fully rationalized by the Enlightenment project of classification and categorization. Law was codified, medicine was professionalized, education was standardized, finance was quantified. But fashion has always maintained a zone of irreducibility at its core, a space where judgment cannot be fully rationalized, where value cannot be fully quantified, where the distinction between art and commerce, between beauty and transgression, between tradition and innovation, remains permanently undecidable. This is why fashion can accommodate Michèle Lamy and why no other institutional system can. The legal system requires that you be categorizable as a legal subject. The medical system requires that you be categorizable as a patient or a practitioner. The educational system requires that you be categorizable as a student or a teacher. The financial system requires that you be categorizable as a creditor or a debtor. But the fashion system requires only that you produce affect, that you generate the specific form of desire, fascination, unease, and aspiration that drives the purchase of luxury goods and the consumption of cultural content. And affect, by definition, is unsortable. You cannot categorize a feeling. You cannot credential an aura. You cannot quantify the experience of encountering Michèle Lamy at a Rick Owens show and feeling that you are in the presence of something that no existing category can describe. This is also why the fashion system is the most instructive model for understanding what a genuinely post-categorical economy might look like. If the fundamental problem of capitalist modernity is the requirement that everybody be sortable, then the fashion system, in its highest and most radical expressions, represents an exception to this requirement. It is the one space in the Western economy where unsortable power is not merely tolerated, but valued, not merely accommodated, but pursued, not merely accepted, but recognized as the most precious resource available. The fashion industry does not succeed despite its irrationality. It succeeds because of it. It is the one industry that has discovered what the rest of the economy has not, that the most valuable things in the world are the things that cannot be categorized. This does not mean that the fashion industry is utopian or just. It is manifestly neither. The exploitation of garment workers, the environmental devastation of fast fashion, the racial and body type hierarchies that persist within the industry, the class exclusions that determine who can access fashion as a career, all of these are real and serious failures. But the structural principle remains. The fashion system's capacity to convert the illegible into the valuable represents a model that, if applied to other domains of economic and social life, could transform the fundamental relationship between bodies and institutions. What if the healthcare system could accommodate the embodied intelligence of a Magic City dancer? What if the educational system could credential the social acuity of a woman who has navigated Atlanta's underground economy? What if the labor market could recognize the full spectrum of human capability rather than only those capabilities that fit pre-existing categories? These questions are utopian, but they are also structural, and the fashion system's existence as a functioning exception to the rule of categorical sorting demonstrates that they are not merely theoretical. The exception already exists. The question is whether it can be generalized.